I got interested in doing oral history by sheer dumb luck. I was minding my own business one day some years back when I was chair of the history department, and we got a phone call from somebody who wanted in the community who wanted me to talk to somebody who wanted to do oral histories with military veterans. Did we have anyone around who knew anything about World War II? And by then I was teaching military history, so I said, yeah, I guess that would be me. And before I know it, I'm roped into a project being run by a private group that was doing a lot of oral history, particularly with World War II vets. And within about a couple of months, I was on stage with 4 D-Day veterans, helping them tell their stories before a live audience. And that basically got me hooked. I got connected with that group. And eventually, when they had problems, I kind of shipped the whole oral history operation over to Grand Valley. And when I completed my sentence as department chair, oral history is giving you firsthand eyewitness accounts of all sorts of things, and they'll include often a lot of details that would not necessarily make it into conventional books or official reports of things and so forth. Because you're getting people talking about their own lives and their own experiences, and there's a whole lot of things that they may bring up or they might think are interesting or are important that researchers and so forth might not even have thought of. And in the end, it really oral history is doing the kind of thing that historians have always wanted to do or to work with. When you do an oral history, you create a primary source that's a firsthand account. And we've been working with letters and diaries and original documents, all the time. So why not just go talk to the people who live the history and get their version of it? The Library of Congress started a nationwide effort to record veteran stories back around 2000, 2001. And at that point, the idea was to catch up with the surviving World War II veterans while they were still around. But their project included later conflicts. And when we set up ours, we actually created an arrangement that allowed us to be an archiving partner. So rather than send our interviews to the Library of Congress, where they will wind up in an Indiana Jones style box someplace in the back of the library, we can digitize our interviews and get them all up and running on our own website. So Library of Congress starts about 2000, 2001, and I got involved with this with the local group in 2003, and it's really 2006 and 7 that we established the Grand Valley project here. And so since then, we've done 1,500 or so interviews, most of which are accessible on our online archive or our YouTube channel. The Originally, an awful lot of what I was doing in the first 5 years or so were World War II, and we've got hundreds and hundreds. I mean, that's probably the largest group is World War II still. But I have a lot of Vietnam interviews. I have smaller numbers of Korean War interviews, and Korean War vets are a tougher nut to crack for some reason. They're more likely to feel like they've been ignored and nobody cares and they don't want to talk about it, as opposed to Vietnam veterans who eventually are willing to air more of their gripes. But we've got Korean ones, and we've also have interviews with people who've been in more recent conflicts like the Gulf War, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In our project, we also talk to people who serve in between wars. So anyone who's been in the military, whether they've been in a conflict or not, we will talk to. We also talk to civilians who may work with the military or they were simply witnesses to some of the conflicts that we've been involved in. And so I've actually talked to Vietnamese refugees. I have talked to Europeans who were simply living in Europe during World War II. We've got a few German POWs and things like that, including one or two who came and worked in Michigan and liked it so much they stayed. So we have cast a pretty broad net, and a little bit broader probably than the Library of Congress does. But a lot of those sort of peripheral interviews are really very interesting. And again, you're recording stories that you simply would not have if you didn't go get them. Well, undergrads have been in the middle of this from the beginning. I mean, the very first thing that we did, even before setting up shop at Grand Valley, was plan to create a documentary based on interviews with local National Guardsmen who were in New Guinea at the end of 1942. So some of the first Army troops to be engaged after the Philippines. And had a thoroughly miserable time. So we called the documentary Nightmare in New Guinea. But the way we did this was we set up a history class. So history students studied the campaign and they helped conduct the interviews. And then a couple of them were also film students and they worked on some of the editing. And actually, one of my students did a big research project on this, and the scriptwriter stole most of her paper for the narration for the video. So we've had, we can steal it, we credit her, but we've had undergrads involved. And then since then, I've used undergraduates to help process the interviews and convert the videos for the websites. For a long time, we were doing detailed outlines of the interviews, which student workers could do fairly easily. And those served as finding aids for people who are trying to navigate the archive, because you could just search those files and know what they talk about. More recently, we've gone over to full transcripts. And so right now we have a batch of a couple hundred interviews with transcripts that we've slowly accumulated that are getting ready to go be added to the main archive. So they do those kinds of things. Some students have done interviews. And attended sessions. I will often have film students working with me who will do some of the interview shoots when we work in a studio setting. If I can get a film student or two who are helping to run it, then that's great. So then I've had some doing kind of promotional things. I have someone doing social media stuff for me now. So you really have opportunities for students, a lot of history students, but students from other parts of campus. And I don't usually have to recruit. They just tend to show up and say, I heard about what you're doing. How can I help? I like those people. And so I've had probably at least 100 student assistants in the past, 15 years or whatever working on this thing, and probably more than that. Some of them are paid research assistants. Some of them are interns who get course credit for their work. And a number of them wind up then going on to careers in public history or things like that. And they actually, or information systems or things, and they take what they learned working in this project and they find that they have a real leg up on the competition when they go to the next level. It's certainly been a very valuable experience for the students who work with me. And I will hear from them periodically or that kind of thing. Or, one fellow was a teacher out in Fremont these days who assisted me with the very first interviews I did back when I thought he did somebody else to run the camera for me. So he came along one summer. He said, that was a blast. That was the best thing I ever did. That sort of stuff. It's also something now where my former students who take my military history class, because I use the interviews in classes, and they say, and they'll ask me about that and interviews to use and other things like that. And so that's still out there. So, so it really does all kinds of things for students, both when you're creating it and with the end product. One of the things we did after the first documentary was to try to find a different kind of project. And so we wound up deciding to do something on the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, because there was a team in Grand Rapids. There were some players still around from it that my collaborator knew. And so we started working on that, and that actually became a project that focused on the history of the entire league for its full 12 years of existence. And the starting point there was that women's baseball league was home front World War II. It wound up becoming a lot more than that, and so we made a documentary about that called A Team of Their Own. And since then, I've stayed involved with the league's organization and have been producing short videos that focus on different aspects of their experiences. And another project that we started that is moving slowly because my student film editors keep disappearing is a documentary series based on interviews with Marine Corps veterans who served in Vietnam. And so we did one episode basically about boot camp, and that one is done. And then we have a couple others that are in process there. Aside from documentaries and of course the videos themselves that go up on the website so people can use them, I do a lot of public appearances. I will go to schools and libraries, museums and community groups and things like that, and talk about the project and the kinds of things that we learned from that. And researchers use our material in books or other things that they produce. A British author not long ago doing a book about sort of eyewitness experiences from the Korean War. His American component is all our interviews. He found them easier to access and work with than what the Library of Congress had. So there we are. And he used Imperial War. So it's me and the Imperial War Museum there doing that. And just as a as an idea of the range of things with the women's baseball stuff. Some pieces of those interviews have wound up in textbooks. And there's a woman who does children's books who did a kind of about sixth grade level illustrated history of the league. And she pulled a lot of material for that directly out of our interviews. So we've created the archive with the idea that people can use it for all kinds of different purposes. And we do our best to kind of get out there and to communicate with people what we're doing and what the value of it is. The baseball thing, basically, for a long time, you know, the fellow who originally roped me into getting involved doing oral history work was a fellow who was interested in making documentaries. So we finished one. Okay, what's the next one going to be? And he actually, in this case, had an ex-girlfriend who knew some of the baseball players and had done a short video about them. He said, "Let's go do that," because he had met a couple of these people. So it was going to be the Grand Rapids Chicks. And we started recording interviews with the local ones. And then one of them, you know, said to my collaborator, "Hey, we're having a national reunion out in Milwaukee. You can just bring a crew and talk to everybody." And so, you know, I'm director of the project. And so I say, okay. So we organize it. So we're going to bring some students and film people over with us and go do all of this. And then I'm getting in touch with the league organization, finding out we haven't actually been invited. Because, as it turned out, they had actually hired a documentary filmmaker to do a documentary for them. They were paying this person. And then people conducted interviews, but then demanded more money and never gave them the interviews. So when the league's board found out we were doing this, they heard a documentary, they went, But they did let me come and talk to them. So I went out early and met with the board. And fortunately for me, some of those women baseball players went on not just to get college degrees, but become academics. So they understood where I was coming from and who I was. And because by that time we had a website up and I could just walk in and say, okay, what I will guarantee you is we do these interviews, they will be accessible to the public just like the veteran interviews are. And that was the big thing they wanted. And then if we're able to put it together, we'll do a documentary, but we'll do that with your approval. And they went, okay. At that point, then we just went in and started meeting them, and we were members of the family in no time. And this is a very close-knit group of women. I mean, there were often, a lot of them didn't know each other while they were playing, because the league went on for 12 years. The teams were fairly small. The women went in and out during that time. But as a group since then, you know, they really are very closely connected. And some of them did play together and were that close then too. But anyway, that was a group that, you know, you kind of fall in love with, because anybody who at the age of 15 or 16 or 17 in those 40s or 50s leaves home and goes off to play professional baseball as a girl, you got to have a certain amount of gumption if you're going to do that. And that stays with them. They still have all the character they had when they were kids. And so you hang out with that kind of group. And as long as you're not afraid of strong women, it's a great place to be. Well, the most striking parts of it usually are ones where you get into an interview session where somebody is telling a particularly intense story. And sometimes it's the first time they've ever really put it together. And you're there asking the questions, you're kind of helping them through. Because interviewing in some ways is really easy, because you're letting somebody else talk. And as long as you're not trying to hog the attention all the time, then you let them talk. But you also have to kind of intuit what's going on with the other person and kind of help them through difficult things, or to sort things out or make sense, or just present a series of questions that kind of leads them to putting the whole story in order. So you get to one of those, sometimes what happens is that veteran is back wherever they were in that experience, pretty much reliving it. And you're kind of hanging on for the ride as best you can and trying to stay focused and not necessarily lose it yourself, because you'll get really, really intense things sometimes. And when that happens, then that has an effect on you as an interviewer. It stays with you. So just as one example, there was a fellow who was a bombardier in a B-24 bomber in World War II, who was shot down while over Germany. And the story begins with him talking about how that morning he just knew he wasn't coming back. So he didn't bother to fix the shoelace on his boot because he wasn't going to need it again. And he went through how he was going to get out of the plane when it was hit, and running all, and said he'd never done that before. He did it that day. And that day, sure enough, they're hit. And on a B-24, there is a kind of a plexiglass nose cone on the front end of the aircraft, and that's where you sit as the bombardier. And so he's in this, and he's watching the anti-aircraft fire, and eventually he hears the thud, and his plane is hit, and the nose cone breaks off of the, I guess it's still attached to the plane, and he can't get out. The air pressure won't let him use the door. And so he's trapped. He talks literally about his life flashing before his eyes, and he describes what happens. He's just resigned to dying, and then the nose cone breaks off, and he's flying in midair and parachutes down. And he talks about that and about landing in the Rhine River and being fished out by Polish slave workers who try to hide them, and then the German police find him. And he's going through this story. And it took far longer to tell the story of being shot down than it actually physically did to happen. But you get through all of this. And this is a case where one of his daughters, a couple other relatives, and a couple other people were in the room with us when we were shooting this. And he gets to the end of that story, and all of us are just totally wiped out. Fortunately, at that point, the cameraman had to go someplace else, so I had to come back and finish the rest of the story on a later date. But I remember just walking out of there. I go, because it just sort of took that much out of you. But the other side of that is that when you do that, the veterans are usually very glad that that happened. And they will tell you sometimes, I either never told that story before, or I never had the chance to kind of put it all together like that. And now that actually makes sense to me. So you kind of help them get control of their own experiences, which is mostly a good thing. My original broader research interests were in 16th century France, which this has nothing to do with whatever. But basically, it was something where when I went into history initially, I just studied fields that seemed interesting. I did 16th century France because in graduate school, because that was as far back as I could go in time and as far away from suburban Chicago as I could go with my language skills. And I found it an interesting topic, and I did some kind of conventional historical work in that. And there was always something missing. As I look back on it, I mean, I could have made much more of a career there if I really wanted to, but there was something not there. And so I wound up kind of falling into administrative work for a while, but I also designed a military history course. And I'd always found that interesting. And once you get into the 80s and 90s, people writing about World War II or things like that started to use a lot of world history. So by the time I started doing interviews, I knew the value of it and how much it added to the stories. So basically what wound up happening was that military history kind of took over my research interest. So my primary activity really has been doing the interviews, although now I have other projects in the works. In the process of doing interviews, I picked up a manuscript of a World War II soldier's memoir from his family. I mean, the man died about 20 years ago, but he'd written actually a very interesting memoir. He tried to get it published and failed. And I took a look at it and thought, yeah, I can do something with this. And so I actually have a sabbatical project for next year set up where I'm going to edit that for publication. And I drafted a kind of large Vietnam manuscript based on my interviews on a previous sabbatical that was basically about 3 books in one. And my plan really is, after I get the memoir out, is to start working on 3 different projects. One of them being about the people who went to Vietnam who were not combat soldiers, because that's most of them, and they don't make it into the books and the movies. What did those guys do? Another one, kind of Michigan in Vietnam, where you have kind of a random sampling of people who were from here or wound up here. And the people in your community, in your society who were in Vietnam, and what kinds of things did they do? And then the big one is going to be a more serious military history study of a specific operation that took place in 1970 that people don't know anything about. But it was a large operation. The men who were involved in it was around a fire base called Ripcord. They have their own association, and there's a popular book about them that's now badly out of date. And I've been interviewing those guys for a decade now. And so I have my own collection of interviews and am ready at some point to go and do a serious analysis of that campaign and try to get the story right, because it's not out there yet. So we're always looking for people to interview, and really anybody who's been in the service at any point in time, we're certainly interested in talking to. So anybody seeing this within the next decade, by all means, contact us and we'll set something up for you.